Younger followers worried not only for Socrates' life, but for the future of philosophy itself. Would questioning now be dangerous? Would thinkers be punished for asking the wrong questions? Meanwhile, supporters of the verdict argued fiercely that Socrates had received fair treatment. They pointed to the vote numbers and reminded others that he had been treated as any citizen would be. Some argued that his teachings destabilized the minds of wealthy youths and encouraged disrespect toward democracy. To them, Socrates represented elitist thinking disguised as virtue. They pointed out that he refused to apologize or compromise, proving that he believed himself superior to the law. The political mood of Athens was fragile. The city had only recently restored democracy. It needed unity, not dissent. Many citizens believed that executing Socrates would help erase painful memories of the 30 tyrants. They thought eliminating him would remove philosophical seeds that once sprouted into treasonous leadership. Their logic was flawed, but the emotional weight behind it was enormous. Inside his holding cell, Socrates waited calmly. His friends visited him daily. They begged him to plan an escape. Exile was possible. Bribing guards was common. But Socrates rejected the idea. He believed that running from the verdict would contradict his principles. A man must obey the laws of his city, even if those laws act unjustly. To flee would mean admitting that philosophy existed only in comfort. And Socrates believed philosophy must endure under all conditions. During these final days, Socrates continued teaching. His cell became an academy where truth was explored more intensely than ever. He discussed life after death, the immortality of the soul, and the meaning of virtue. He believed that death might not be an ending, but a transition to a place where the soul could converse with heroes and thinkers of the past. His calm, glowing certainty terrified his enemies, who expected despair or regret. Instead, Socrates appeared excited, not for death, but for the possibility of truth beyond physical existence. Athens could not silence philosophy, even by condemning its greatest voice. Instead, the city unintentionally amplified it. Citizens who had never heard Socrates speak before now listened to his ideas. Young men who once ignored philosophy now whispered his name with reverence. The irony was overwhelming. The trial meant to suppress thought unleashed a philosophical revolution. Socrates' death sentence was not merely a legal decision. It marked a turning point in Western history. It sparked a question that has echoed through 2 millennia. Should a society punish those who question its beliefs? This question traveled far beyond Athens. It shaped the teachings of Plato, influenced the foundations of Christianity, guided Enlightenment thinkers, and still haunts modern democracies. The trial of Socrates proved that truth and power often collide, and history remembers the victim more than the victor. Socrates remained in prison, awaiting execution. Yet the story was far from over. The next chapter would unfold behind stone walls, where philosophy and mortality would meet face to face. After the verdict was delivered and the death sentence determined, Socrates was escorted from the Heliaea court to the state prison. Though condemned, he was not treated with cruelty. Athenian law allowed those awaiting execution to receive visitors, speak freely, and maintain dignity. His body was not chained to the wall, nor was he isolated in a dark cell. Instead, he was placed in a modest chamber made of rough stone with a small barred window near the top. It allowed a thin stream of sunlight to enter each morning. From inside, Socrates could hear footsteps of guards, the chatter of street merchants, and faint conversations carrying from the Agora. His world had shrunk physically but expanded intellectually. In the days following his sentencing, Athens remained divided. Outside the prison walls, people argued constantly about the fairness of the verdict. Many Athenians believed that the city, still recovering from political trauma, had judged harshly. Others insisted that Athens had protected itself, believing Socrates' teachings could lead to rebellion or religious decline. Yet inside the prison, far from public noise, a quieter and more profound drama unfolded. There, one of the most influential conversations in Western history would take shape. Socrates' closest students and friends visited him daily. Among them were Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, Simmias, and Cebes. Their footsteps echoed as they walked down the narrow stone corridor to his cell. Each day, they brought him food, conversation, and emotional support. They did not treat these visits as farewells, but as opportunities to learn. The prison became an extension of the Agora. Instead of crowds watching, there were intimate gatherings of men who wished to preserve every word the philosopher spoke. One central reason Socrates remained alive for several weeks, instead of facing immediate execution, was a religious tradition. Each year, the city sent a sacred ship to the island of Delos to honor Apollo. While the ship was away, Athens could not execute a single prisoner condemned to death. The belief was that no blood could be spilled within the city while the sacred mission was underway. As luck, or fate, would have it, Socrates was condemned shortly after the ship had been launched. This meant he would remain alive until the vessel returned. Thus began a period of approximately 30 days, during which Socrates continued to teach, reflect, and comfort his companions. This unexpected delay provided Athens with one last chance to observe the workings of Socratic philosophy. Day after day, Socrates engaged his visitors in discussions about justice, the soul, courage, and mortality. He refused to wallow in sorrow. Instead, he appeared energized, fascinated by the possibilities of death. He argued that fearing death was irrational because nobody truly knew whether death was harmful. His calmness stunned his companions. Some wondered whether the philosopher had transcended human emotion. Others wept openly, not just for his impending death, but because they recognized that his spirit was unbreakable. The prison guards, initially indifferent, grew respectful. They had never witnessed such serenity in a condemned prisoner. Often, they lingered outside his cell simply to listen. They were captivated by his voice, gentle, logical, unwavering. In many cases, guards carrying out executions in Athens had to endure begging, screams, and resistance. Socrates offered the opposite. Some guards later reported feeling guilt because they knew they would have to enforce a death sentence on a man whose courage far surpassed their own. As the days passed, Socrates continued to ask questions, not only to his students, but also to himself. He explored the nature of the soul, wondering whether its existence continued beyond the body. He considered whether death was a release, a transition, or a doorway to more knowledge. His friends listened, torn between philosophical fascination and overwhelming sadness. They recognized that Athens might be killing its greatest teacher, yet Socrates never expressed hatred toward the city. If anything, he expressed compassion for those who had judged him. In his view, they acted out of ignorance, not malice. Thus, he harbored no resentment. Night in the prison brought silence. Torches flickered against stone walls, shadows dancing like spirits. Plato later wrote that Socrates slept peacefully through most nights, as though untroubled by thoughts of his approaching end. Crito once claimed that Socrates slept like a child without burden, demonstrating a kind of spiritual peace that most men achieved only in old age or never at all. For the students who visited daily, the prison became sacred space. They gathered not just to mourn, but to witness a man testing philosophy against death. This period, though tragic, became a critical chapter in the story of Western thought, showing that philosophy did not merely exist for intellectual debate, but for confronting the deepest human experiences. One of the most important conversations during Socrates' final days was recorded in Plato's dialogue Crito. Crito, a wealthy and loyal friend, arrived at the prison before dawn one morning. He had bribed the guards to enter early, showing how deeply he loved his teacher. Crito begged Socrates to escape. He explained that exile would allow Socrates to continue teaching in another city, perhaps in Thessaly or Megara, where philosophers were valued and protected. Crito argued that Socrates owed it to his friends to save himself. Otherwise, people might believe they lacked courage or loyalty. Socrates listened quietly and then responded with gentle firmness. He asked Crito whether it was ever right to do wrong in return for wrong. Crito answered no. Socrates then asked whether escaping prison would violate the laws of Athens. Crito hesitated. For Socrates, the answer was clear. To flee would be to break the laws, and breaking the laws would contradict everything he had taught. He believed that justice had value even when justice acted unfairly. Socrates also argued that the laws of Athens had shaped his entire life, his education, his citizenship, and his opportunities. If he fled, he would be rejecting the very system that nurtured him. He told Crito that he could not betray the laws simply to preserve his body. To Socrates, the body was temporary. The soul was eternal. Preserving the soul meant protecting moral integrity. His execution, therefore, was not a defeat, but a philosophical conclusion. The body dies, the soul continues. Crito wept, insisting that Socrates owed something to his children. He argued that by escaping, Socrates could raise them into adulthood. But Socrates explained that a father teaches more through moral example than physical presence. By accepting death with dignity rather than running from it, he believed he would teach his sons and students more profoundly. This dialogue reveals a truth deeper than historical detail. Socrates refused to reshape philosophy to save himself. He treated ideas as sacred. If he abandoned his principles under pressure, his entire life's work would collapse into hypocrisy. After the conversation ended, Crito felt devastated but unable to argue further. He recognized that Socrates' reasoning rested upon unbreakable foundations. Philosophy was not something Socrates used, it was something he embodied. Another major theme in Socrates' imprisonment period was the discussion about the immortality of the soul, recorded in Plato's Phaedo. During these conversations, Socrates explained that death was not destruction but transition. He described the soul as immortal, existing before birth and after death. He used examples from mathematics. The concept of equality or justice was universal and existed outside the physical world. Therefore, the soul must have contact with eternal truths before entering the body. Simmias and Cebes challenged him. They worried that the soul might be like a harmony produced by a musical instrument, beautiful but dependent on the body. When the instrument broke, perhaps the music vanished. Socrates listened patiently, then argued that the soul must be more than harmony because humans possessed moral reasoning, self-awareness, and the ability to question desire. These capacities, he said, pointed to something divine within human nature. He described death not with anxiety, but with curiosity. Perhaps he would meet Homer or Hesiod. Perhaps he would question Achilles or Odysseus. To speak with the dead would be the next great philosophical conversation. Unlike most people afraid of death's silence, Socrates imagined death as a symposium of eternal thought. These ideas stunned his listeners. Some believed him and drew comfort. Others struggled because philosophy demanded that they abandon fear. Many wept silently while Socrates spoke, knowing they had only days left with him. As days turned into weeks, the prison became a gathering place not only for students, but also for distant admirers who had heard the news and traveled across Greece. Some came from Thebes, others from Corinth and Argos. They wished to see the philosopher with their own eyes, believing his death would mark a historic moment. Athens, ironically, became the philosophical center of mourning. The city that condemned Socrates unintentionally glorified him. Every whispered street conversation made him more famous. Inside the cell, discussions shifted toward deeper emotional and metaphysical territory. Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, visited him with their children. She wept bitterly, unable to accept the fate awaiting her husband. Their youngest son clung to Socrates and begged him not to die. This moment pierced the hearts of all who witnessed it. Even the guards looked away. Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past comes alive with depth, emotion, and truth. Today, you are entering one of the most powerful journeys in human history, the life, trial, and execution of the legendary Greek philosopher Socrates. This is not just a story about a man. It is a story about knowledge, courage, democracy, justice, and the human soul itself. In this historical experience, you will travel back 2,400 years to the heart of ancient Athens, where philosophy clashed with politics, truth faced corruption, and wisdom stood against fear. You will witness the rise of Socrates, a barefoot thinker who changed the world with nothing but questions. You will see how his teaching shook the foundations of society, influenced Plato and Aristotle, shaped modern universities, inspired democratic law, and set the moral blueprint for civilizations across continents. This is a story of how one voice challenged an entire nation, how an old philosopher refused to run from death, choosing truth over safety, how Socrates' final breath became the birth of Western thinking. By the end, you will understand why kings feared him, why students loved him, why enemies hated him, and why the whole world remembers him today. So sit back, relax, and prepare to experience one of the most unforgettable histories ever told. If you love deep storytelling, real history, emotional journeys, and mind-opening truths, you're in the right place. Welcome to the trial of Socrates. Welcome to philosophy versus politics. Welcome to the moment that changed humanity forever. Only here on History Teller YT. Before the dramatic trial of Socrates in 399 BCE, Athens was a city carrying deep wounds and unresolved conflicts, shaped by decades of war, political instability, and cultural transformation. To understand why Athenians turned against a 70-year-old philosopher who had spent his life asking questions, one must look closely at the Athens of that era, a society trying to rebuild, a government struggling to reconnect with its people, and a community unsure whether traditional values or new thought would best protect their future. The Peloponnesian War had ended just 5 years earlier in 404 BCE, leaving Athens defeated by Sparta. The war lasted almost 30 years, destroying farmland, draining treasury reserves, and weakening the confidence Athenians once had in democracy. Their famous political system, which had been praised for equality and civic pride, was blamed by some citizens for the defeat, since it allowed persuasive voices to push Athens into disastrous decisions. Philosophers, generals, ordinary people, slaves, and wealthy aristocrats debated endlessly over who should be accountable. The shadow of the recent dictatorship also lingered over the city. After Athens surrendered, the Spartans installed the 30 Tyrants, an oligarchic regime known for cruelty, executions, and political purges. Hundreds of Athenians were exiled or killed, property was seized, and fear replaced open debate. When democracy was restored in 403 BCE, the emotional scars remained. People were desperate to identify enemies within, and many believed that philosophical questioning, especially questioning the gods and the democracy itself, might invite new chaos. Socrates, who openly criticized politicians, was connected through reputation to several men who had harmed Athens. Alcibiades, the charismatic aristocrat who betrayed the city and joined Sparta, and Critias, the ruthless leader of the 30 Tyrants, who had once been Socrates' student. Although Socrates never engaged in politics and did not support tyranny, the public memory was not subtle. Philosophers asking troubling questions became easy targets. Athens also had a cultural anxiety: religion. The gods were tied to legal authority and social identity. Anyone seen weakening belief in the gods was seen as weakening the community. Socrates' method, examining ideas of holiness, truth, and virtue through reason rather than myth, felt dangerous to traditionalists who feared disrespect toward the divine. The trial of Socrates, therefore, was not simply a legal event. It was a collision between old Athens and new intellectual Athens, between previous trauma and desired security. To understand the historical momentum that led towards Socrates' indictment, we must examine the unique social environment of Athens in the late 5th century BCE, where philosophy, democracy, and civic identity were all undergoing dramatic evolution. After the death of Pericles in 429 BCE, Athens entered a period of leadership uncertainty. Unlike monarchies or oligarchies, the democracy depended on skilled rhetoric rather than birthright to gain influence. Men spoke in the assembly, convincing crowds to vote on major policies. Some Athenians believed that persuasive speakers, not wise decision-makers, held too much power. Sophists, teachers who trained wealthy youths in argument, presentation, and persuasion, flourished during this period, offering expensive lessons in persuasive speech. These sophists influenced culture deeply, teaching skills that made people powerful in courts and politics, but sometimes encouraging moral relativism. Socrates stood firmly against this trend. He argued that truth mattered more than eloquence, that wisdom mattered more than persuasion, and that a person must recognize their own ignorance before seeking improvement. Socrates comforted Xanthippe gently, telling her that everything born must die, and fear served no purpose in a world governed by divine order. Eventually, he asked that she be escorted away because her grief made philosophical discussion impossible. Though this may appear cold, Socrates' decision reflected his priority, clear thinking. In his final days, he believed that discussion of the soul's destiny mattered more than emotion. He wanted his students to see death not through tears, but through reason. In the afternoons, Plato recorded dialogue after dialogue. He knew the world needed to hear Socrates' words beyond the grave. Sometimes Socrates spoke about cosmic cycles, reincarnation, and the rewards awaiting virtuous souls. At other moments, he examined simple ethical truths. He told the men that doing evil to others poisoned the soul more deeply than any physical wound. He insisted that injustice harmed the wrongdoer more than the victim. Visitors found themselves transformed. They entered the prison as ordinary people and left as devoted followers of philosophy. Many later became teachers, spreading Socratic ideas across the Mediterranean. Through this chain of influence, Socrates' death became a birth. Not the end of his life, but the beginning of a global movement. Meanwhile, Athens continued to evolve outside the prison walls. Some citizens regretted the verdict and felt shame. They wondered if democracy had failed. Others felt triumphant, believing the execution would restore traditional virtues. But none could ignore the enormous intellectual presence now contained behind stone bars. Finally, word arrived that the sacred ship returning from Delos had been sighted approaching the harbor. The waiting period was over. Socrates would be executed within 24 hours. When the news reached the prison, the guards felt numb. Some begged to be relieved from duty. Ironically, because of his questioning style, many Athenians confused him with sophists, seeing him as another intellectual figure threatening traditional values. The political memory of betrayal amplified suspicion. Alcibiades, brilliant and ambitious, had been close to Socrates. When accused of sacrilege in Athens, he fled and led Spartan forces against Athens, later switching sides again. Critias, another former associate, led the extremist oligarchic regime after the city's fall. Though Socrates himself rejected their corruption, guilt by association became a useful weapon for his enemies. Athens needed symbolic justice to restore civic pride. Executing a tyrant or traitor was impossible. They were dead or gone. But Socrates was present, well-known, and vulnerable. Religion also shaped identity. Athenians worshipped Athena, Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus, and countless other gods were believed to watch over the city. Public festivals, sacrifices, and rituals were essential to the peace and prosperity of the state. Socrates' habit of questioning the nature of piety led some citizens to believe that he doubted or rejected traditional religion. Even though Socrates said he believed strongly in spiritual guidance, the voice of his personal daimonion, his religious views did not match the standard mold. Athens, scarred by war, saw unorthodox thinking as a threat to unity. The socioeconomic landscape, too, played a role. War destroyed farms and damaged maritime trade routes. Many poor citizens relied on jury pay and state support. leading to resentment toward wealthy aristocrats and intellectual elites who were perceived as arrogant or disconnected from common struggle. Socrates frequently spoke with wealthy young men who admired his independence and intellect. This fed rumors that he was corrupting youth by turning them against their father's traditions. All these factors, war trauma, political memory, religious anxiety, economic strain, and generational conflict, merged into fertile ground for the accusation that Socrates threatened the foundations of the Athenian state. The philosophical environment of Athens leading up to Socrates' trial was incredibly dynamic, yet deeply conflicted. Athens valued intellectual achievement, producing playwrights like Euripides and Aristophanes, historians like Thucydides and Herodotus, and thinkers like Anaxagoras and Protagoras. But during periods of stress, open inquiry, once a symbol of Athenian pride, became frightening. Free speech, known as parrhesia, allowed citizens to speak boldly in the assembly and criticize the government. However, after the war, parrhesia was not universally welcomed. Some believed unrestricted speech had contributed to defeat through reckless decision-making encouraged by clever orators. Socrates' method, known as the elenchus, involved questioning people in public spaces, the agora, gymnasia, workshops, and religious festivals. He questioned generals, artisans, poets, and statesmen, using logic to expose contradictions in their thinking. Many admired this. Many more felt mocked or humiliated. These people would later sit as jurors in his trial. The Athenian legal system allowed large juries, often numbering 500 or more, drawn from everyday citizens, not trained legal professionals. Trials became performance arenas where arguments, emotional appeals, and public reputation mattered as much as logic. It was within this system that Socrates, aged 70, would soon stand and defend his life. Athens had long embraced myths, poetry, and dramatic arts as ways to explore moral lessons. But Socrates demanded rational argument, not emotional narrative. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that doing wrong resulted from ignorance, and that improvement came through continuous questioning. This threatened traditional understandings of morality based on ancestral customs, divine commands, and civic loyalty. Furthermore, Athens had recently declared amnesty after the fall of the 30 tyrants. No citizen could legally be prosecuted for crimes committed during the oligarchic regime. Because Socrates had never broken a law, his enemies needed a different strategy. They chose charges not tied to amnesty, impiety, and corruption of youth. These accusations were vague enough to shape into whatever the prosecution needed. Philosophical movements across the Greek world influenced Athenians' fears as well. Natural philosophers proposed ideas about cosmology that challenged mythological explanations. Atomism, promoted by Democritus, suggested the universe functioned by physical laws rather than divine intervention. Though Socrates himself avoided natural science inquiries, the public connected intellectual questioning with atheism. The comedic playwright Aristophanes added fuel by portraying Socrates as a sophist who taught students to manipulate truth and disrespect authority. This comedic image hardened into public memory. Many Athenians judged Socrates not by his actual teachings, but by exaggerated rumor, misunderstandings, and cultural fear. Therefore, as 399 BCE approached, Athens was a tinderbox. It wanted stability, unity, and religious protection. Yet Socrates stood embodying the opposite. He represented relentless questioning, refusal to flatter the crowd, and loyalty to personal conscience rather than public opinion. For a society traumatized by war and tyranny, such independence seemed dangerous. The stage was now set for accusations, court proceedings, and a philosophical battle that would echo through millennia. As the year 399 BCE arrived, the political air in Athens carried whispers and tension. The wounds of war and tyranny still glimmered beneath community life, and public trust in philosophy continued to decline. Socrates, well into his 70s, had spent decades speaking openly in the Agora, challenging men who believed they possessed wisdom. Over time, his enemies grew in number. Men who had been embarrassed in debate, families whose sons had turned toward intellectual thinking, and traditionalists who believed Athens should return to stricter religious devotion all turned an increasingly critical eye toward the aging philosopher. Yet even with these personal hostilities, it required more than rumor to place Socrates on trial. Athens had a judicial system requiring formal charges, legal witnesses, and prosecutors. 3 men ultimately stepped forward and took that historic role: Miletus, Anytus, and Lyco. Each actor reflected an aspect of Athens' unrest, and in them we see how political revenge, cultural anxiety, and generational distrust merged into a legal weapon. Miletus, the primary accuser, was a young poet with little literary reputation. He did not possess Socrates' fame, nor the respect of powerful families. Some historians believe his involvement was driven by personal pride. He may have felt the intellectuals mocked him and wanted to strike a blow for poets and religious traditionalists. Miletus charged Socrates with impiety, failing to believe in the gods of the city and introducing strange new deities. Although this claim lacked strong textual evidence, Miletus used public fear of atheism and cosmological speculation to craft an argument that intellectual questioning endangered Athens' unity and offended the gods. He also accused Socrates of corrupting the youth, claiming that Socrates encouraged disobedience toward parents, rejected traditional authority, and inspired arrogance in the younger generation. According to Miletus, Socrates' conversations caused youth to disrespect religion, question democratic process, and elevate reason above reverence. But Miletus did not stand alone. Anytus, a powerful politician and democratic defender, supported the prosecution with energy and influence. He came from a wealthy background and was deeply invested in protecting Athens' restored democracy after the fall of the 30 tyrants. Anytus believed that intellectuals like Socrates encouraged disdain toward democratic institutions by praising aristocratic discipline and questioning the competence of elected officials. His resentment towards Socrates may also have come from personal experience. Socrates' disagreements with democracy were well known, and Socrates had once criticized the profession and moral integrity of craftsmen and politicians. Anytus belonged to both worlds. Moreover, Anytus' own son was rumored to admire Socrates, perhaps increasing the man's hostility. A father threatened by losing influence over his child might see a philosopher as an enemy. The third accuser, Lyco, represented another frustrated social bloc, the rhetoricians. Lyco feared that Socrates undermined public speech culture. Rhetoricians believed that persuasion was central to Athenian identity. If Socrates convinced people that truth trumped persuasion, then rhetoricians risked losing social value. These 3 accusers did not share the same motives, but they aligned under a common desire to silence someone who challenged the foundations of their identities. Their combined power formed the official indictment that would shape history. The charges were accepted by the city, jurors were selected, and a date was scheduled. In the Agora, citizens whispered eagerly. Some hoped Socrates would win easily. After all, he was a beloved public figure to many educated Athenians. Others believed he was dangerous, a spreader of unpopular thought, and a reminder of aristocratic arrogance. The trial's announcement generated a storm of debates in gymnasia, workshops, and public baths. For some, it was a trial about religion. For others, it was about democracy. But beneath all that, it was also about fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of intellectual change, and fear that the future might reject the past. Athens' legal system provided structure and formality to accusations, but it also reflected the philosophical and emotional climate. Any citizen could bring forward legal charges if they believed someone threatened the city. Yet Athens did not employ lawyers in the modern sense. Each defendant had to speak for themselves, relying on their reputation and rhetorical ability. Socrates, infamous for questioning everything, would now be forced to defend his life through those same words. Before the trial began, the written indictment was displayed publicly. In translation, it read, Socrates commits an offense by refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state and introducing new divinities. Further, he corrupts the youth. Penalty: death. This document was posted so any citizen could read it. It was not hidden nor subtle. It declared that Socrates, a lifetime resident of Athens, posed grave danger both spiritually and morally. The accusation of impiety was serious in ancient Greece. Even mythic heroes were punished for angering the gods. Greek religion was not a private faith system like modern religions. It was tied to citizenship, identity, and loyalty to the polis. To reject Athens' gods was not just blasphemy. It was considered betrayal. The gods protected crops, ships, armies, births, marriages, and political decisions. Many Athenians believed that recent disaster and war had occurred because the gods were displeased. The destruction of the fleet in Sicily, the plague that killed thousands, and the humiliation under Spartan occupation were interpreted as divine punishment. Anyone seen weakening religious devotion risked being blamed for misfortune. Miletus used this emotional vulnerability skillfully. He claimed Socrates denied the existence of gods, even though Socrates regularly spoke of divine signs. But nuance did not matter. The people wanted stability and simple answers. Socrates' ideas were complex. Complexity is frightening to a wounded city. The charge of corrupting the youth was even more explosive. Athens had spent enormous effort rebuilding civic loyalty after the 30 tyrants. Young men were encouraged to love democracy, honor their family, and defend the city. Many young aristocrats admired Socrates for his independence and bold truth-seeking. They gathered around him in public, listening as he questioned generals, artisans, and noblemen. Some of these youths belonged to wealthy families linked to former oligarchic movements. Although Socrates never supported political extremism, his association with people like Critias became ammunition. Critics argued that Socrates taught the elite youth to think they were superior to democratic process. They accused him of inspiring rebellion, of turning them away from participation in civic religion, and of making them question the authority of government. In a traumatized society, this looked like sedition. Behind these fears was another dimension: class conflict. Many Athenians living through economic struggle disliked that Socrates often surrounded himself with wealthy youths. They believed he was shaping a privileged class to challenge democratic equality. While this was false, Socrates questioned nobles and common workers equally. The imagery of aristocrats laughing at democratic norms stirred resentment. Some jurors likely entered the trial not to judge Socrates' real beliefs, but to defend their sense of social dignity. They saw him as a man who mocked their intelligence and exposed their ignorance. Anytus capitalized on this emotion. He argued that philosophy weakened civic unity and encouraged people to ignore ancestral laws. His political influence helped move public opinion. When rumor becomes belief and belief becomes fear, legal action becomes inevitable. Thus, Socrates' fate was shaped not only by his accusers' voices, but by a community desperate to rebuild identity. The philosopher represented everything Athens feared it might become: rootless, disobedient, intellectually divided, and morally uncertain. The charges were now official. The jury was formed. The entire city watched. As preparations for the trial continued, Socrates did not flee Athens. Many friends urged him to escape before legal action began, reminding him that exile was common among intellectual targets. But Socrates refused. He believed fleeing would be cowardly and contradict his entire philosophy. He had always argued that one must follow conscience and respect the laws of the polis, even if the polis acted unjustly. Therefore, he welcomed the chance to speak publicly, hoping to educate the jury about truth, virtue, and human ignorance. His calmness confused many Athenians. Some interpreted it as arrogance, others as foolishness. Still others admired him more for it, believing he would win easily because Athens respected intellectual freedom. Meanwhile, the accusers built their narrative. They visited public spaces, and repeated their claims. They reminded people that Athens had recently survived dictatorship, and they warned that Socrates' ideas weakened social order and encouraged political rebellion. They emphasized his connection to Critias, leader of the 30 tyrants, suggesting that Socrates had shaped the mind of a murderer who killed fellow Athenians. They pointed to Alcibiades and argued that Socrates mentored a man who betrayed Athens at its most vulnerable moment. These accusations, though historically dishonest, resonated emotionally. The public could not punish Critias or Alcibiades. They were dead or unreachable. But they could punish Socrates. In this sense, the philosopher became a symbolic sacrifice, a target upon whom Athens could project guilt and shame. Religious officials also added to the pressure. Priests worried that Socrates' rationalism weakened citizen devotion. The Eleusinian Mysteries, major religious rites promising spiritual transformation, relied on secrecy and mythic belief. Socrates' public reasoning threatened to break the sacred silence and diminish awe. Some priests warned that a city ignoring impiety risked further divine punishment. Even though Socrates claimed he believed in the divine more than most men, his version of belief, guided by reason and inner voice, did not match standard expectations. At the same time, the judicial process itself was politicized. Jurors were paid, which meant poorer citizens relied on trials for income. Trials became frequent events, creating a dramatic public culture around accusations. Winning a trial felt like winning a civic battle. Many Athenians saw legal victories as proof of the city's moral strength. A high-profile case against a philosopher promised emotional reward. The accusers understood this and shaped the narrative accordingly. Socrates spent his days before the trial doing what he always did: walking the Agora, talking to people, questioning assumptions. Students remained with him. Some were nervous, others were inspired. Plato, his most devoted follower, would later record that he had never seen Socrates so serene. Socrates believed that if the city killed him, they harmed themselves more than him, because he viewed death as either a peaceful sleep or a doorway to deeper truth. His lack of fear only increased his mythic image. Even before the trial began, he stood out as something more than mortal, a man committed entirely to philosophy. Meanwhile, the people of Athens prepared to witness what many regarded as a turning point. Would Athens protect the right to question authority, even after defeat and trauma? Or had democracy evolved into a system governed by fear and revenge? As the morning sun rose on the day of the trial, thousands gathered outside the court building, excited to see how the strange old philosopher would defend himself. The jurors took their seats. The accusers prepared statements. Socrates stood ready. His trial would not simply decide the fate of one man, but reveal the direction Athens intended to take, toward intellectual courage or political obedience. On the morning of Socrates' trial in 399 BCE, Athens awakened with a sense of spectacle. The city had seen many court battles, political disputes, and legal dramas inside its civic buildings, but few carried this level of symbolism. The trial was held in the Heliaea, the largest court in Athens, where citizens chosen by lot acted as jurors. It was a place where everyday people, not professional lawyers, shaped legal outcomes. As the sun shone upon the court's stone surfaces, hundreds of Athenians began gathering. Some came out of genuine concern for the city, others for intellectual curiosity, and many simply to witness entertainment, because trials in Athens were often intense public events filled with emotions, clever arguments, and dramatic persuasion. The jurors, totaling around 500, represented a cross-section of Athenian society. They were men from farming backgrounds, artisans from the market, veterans from the Peloponnesian War, sailors who once rode triremes, merchants, stonemasons, and men whose small incomes depended on jury wages. Behind them stood spectators, whispering, gossiping, and trading predictions. Some thought Socrates' charm would sway the panel. Others believed the philosopher's reputation for irritating people would doom him. They did not want to serve the death drink to a man who had taught them more about courage than any soldier. Socrates, however, responded with gentle acceptance. He smiled and said death was the natural conclusion of life. He expressed gratitude for the extra days granted by the festival, saying they allowed him to share philosophy more deeply than ever before. His followers did not share his calm. That night, many wept silently as they stared into the darkness, unable to imagine Athens without Socrates. They knew the next morning would bring irreversible loss, not only of a teacher, but of a worldview. The city might remain powerful and democratic, but it would forever carry the scar of having executed its wisest citizen. Tomorrow, Socrates would face his final hour. The hemlock cup awaited. The philosopher who had lived by reason would die by law. What remained was not fear, but an astonishing paradox. Socrates had lost the trial, yet won immortality. His last conversations would echo through time, ensuring that while his body perished, his ideas would never fall silent. The final morning of Socrates' life arrived quietly, like soft wind moving across the surface of the sea. Dawn cast pale light into his stone cell, turning the rough walls into golden shapes. Outside, the city of Athens moved on with its daily routine. Merchants prepared their stalls, fishermen returned to harbor, and children raced through dusty streets. Somewhere nearby, men discussed politics and argued about the future of democracy. Life continued, indifferent to the fact that one of the greatest minds in history was about to leave the world. Yet inside the prison, the atmosphere held a deeper gravity. The friends who visited Socrates every morning entered through the corridor with heavy hearts, knowing this time their presence marked the beginning of farewell. The environment was charged with history. On these grounds, trials concerning murder, treason, and blasphemy had unfolded. Citizens remembered the recent horrors brought by the 30 tyrants. They remembered when oligarchs killed neighbors and stole property. Those memories filled the courtroom with caution and desire for civic righteousness. This trial became symbolic justice, an opportunity to publicly reaffirm Athens' restored democracy. Socrates entered calmly. His manner contrasted sharply with other defendants who often begged for mercy, brought their children to court to gain sympathy, or hired speechwriters. Socrates did none of these things. He believed truth should stand on its own, not be hidden behind theatrics or emotional manipulation. His friends, including Plato and Xenophon, stood nearby as silent supporters. Some younger admirers believed that Socrates could not possibly be condemned. Athens, in their minds, valued free thought too highly. But not everyone felt admiration. Older citizens remembered how Socrates had questioned poets, generals, and politicians. They resented the embarrassment he caused them in public debates. For them, this trial promised vindication. Meanwhile, the accusers, Miletus, Anytus, and Lyco, prepared themselves, knowing that prosecution was risky. If they failed to persuade the jury, they could be fined heavily for bringing false charges. Their strategy was therefore anchored in emotional impact. They would paint Socrates not as a harmless thinker, but as the intellectual root of Athens' greatest tragedies. The court clerk announced silence, and the trial began. The accusers stepped forward, delivering formal introductions, addressing the charges of impiety and corruption. The language was sharp and accusatory. Miletus suggested that Socrates' teachings produced rebellious young men who rejected law and morality. He described Socrates' ideas as intellectual poison. Anytus, more political in tone, warned the jury that Socrates' criticisms of democracy undermined the very system that had saved Athens from tyranny. Lyco accused Socrates of insulting poets and rhetoricians. Together, their voices shaped a narrative. Socrates was not just different, he was dangerous. The audience absorbed every word. Some nodded in agreement. Others glared at the accusers. But everyone awaited Socrates' response. When Socrates finally rose to speak, the atmosphere shifted. His voice carried no fear, no anger, and no desperation. Instead, there was curiosity and confidence. He began by stating that he had no intention of employing traditional courtroom tricks. He would not use dramatic appeals, nor bring forward character witnesses to praise him. He would not beg for sympathy. Socrates argued that truth did not require decoration, and justice should not require persuasion through emotional manipulation. He acknowledged that the charges were serious, but insisted that the jury must use reason rather than passion. Socrates addressed the accusations of Meletus first. With methodical logic, he questioned Meletus openly, using his famous dialectical technique. Before hundreds of listeners, he led Meletus into contradictions, forcing the accuser to admit inconsistencies. For instance, Meletus claimed Socrates was an atheist, yet also claimed Socrates introduced new spiritual beings. Socrates pointed out that these two accusations could not both be true. One could not introduce divine beings without believing in divinity. The crowd murmured. Even some jurors appeared amused. Socrates emphasized that he believed deeply in the existence of divine moral order, guided by his inner voice, the daimonion, which had directed his conscience throughout his life. He then challenged the assertion that he corrupted the youth. Socrates asked the jury to consider whether he intentionally harmed anyone. He reminded them that harming others inevitably harms oneself, because an unjust act damages the soul. Since no rational person would want to harm themselves, the idea that Socrates willingly corrupted young men made no sense. He invited anyone present to testify if they had ever been corrupted by him. No such witnesses came forward. Only students who insisted that Socrates helped them grow wiser. At this point, Socrates explained that his mission came from a divine source, the Oracle of Delphi. Years earlier, his friend Chaerephon had asked the oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle responded, "No one is wiser." Socrates explained that he was puzzled by this and believed the oracle was not speaking about knowledge he possessed, but about his awareness of ignorance. He argued that his philosophical questioning served Athens by exposing false wisdom and encouraging moral improvement. Instead of condemning him, he believed the city should reward him for service. This bold claim shocked many listeners. They had expected humility. Instead, Socrates announced himself as a gift from the gods to Athens. Some jurors admired this honesty. Others saw arrogance. Socrates continued by criticizing the democratic process, though not directly. He described how crowds could be easily swayed by rhetoric rather than truth. He warned the jurors that they should avoid becoming instruments of injustice out of fear or prejudice. His words reminded Athens of its intellectual legacy, the birthplace of inquiry, drama, philosophy, and citizenship. But he also reminded them that they had recently killed and exiled thousands under the influence of tyrants and mob mentality. These reminders were risky. Asking Athenians to remember their failures could anger them rather than enlighten them. Many spectators whispered that Socrates seemed to be defending not only his life, but his philosophy itself. He reminded them that harming others inevitably harms oneself, because an unjust act damages the soul. Since no rational person would want to harm themselves, the idea that Socrates willingly corrupted young men made no sense. He invited anyone present to testify if they had ever been corrupted by him. No such witnesses came forward. Only students who insisted that Socrates helped them grow wiser. At this point, Socrates explained that his mission came from a divine source, the Oracle of Delphi. Years earlier, his friend Chaerephon had asked the oracle whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle responded, "No one is wiser." Socrates explained that he was puzzled by this and believed the oracle was not speaking about knowledge he possessed, but about his awareness of ignorance. He argued that his philosophical questioning served Athens by exposing false wisdom and encouraging moral improvement. Instead of condemning him, he believed the city should reward him for service. This bold claim shocked many listeners. They had expected humility. Instead, Socrates announced himself as a gift from the gods to Athens. Some jurors admired this honesty. Others saw arrogance. Socrates continued by criticizing the democratic process, though not directly. He described how crowds could be easily swayed by rhetoric rather than truth. He warned the jurors that they should avoid becoming instruments of injustice out of fear or prejudice. His words reminded Athens of its intellectual legacy, the birthplace of inquiry, drama, philosophy, and citizenship. But he also reminded them that they had recently killed and exiled thousands under the influence of tyrants and mob mentality. These reminders were risky. Asking Athenians to remember their failures could anger them rather than enlighten them. Many spectators whispered that Socrates seemed to be defending not only his life, but his philosophy itself. His tone was more like a teacher addressing students than a defendant pleading with judges. He appeared fearless, even indifferent to punishment. To some, this was heroic courage. To others, it was disrespect for the court. Athens expected contrition, not challenge. Socrates gave them challenge. The trial continued with increasing tension. Socrates used his remaining time to address deeper themes: truth, virtue, and the moral responsibility of the city. He argued that a good man cannot be harmed by a bad man, because true harm affects the soul, not the body. He said the only real evil was ignorance, and the purpose of a citizen was to pursue wisdom. If Athens condemned him for this pursuit, he claimed the city would damage itself more than it damaged him. These words resonated deeply with Platonists and young intellectuals, but also angered those who believed Athens needed practicality, not philosophy. Socrates distinguished between public reputation and real virtue. He explained that the majority's opinion could not make something true or false. If 1,000 people believed injustice was justice, that did not transform it into truth. Athens valued democratic consensus, but Socrates insisted that morality transcended popular judgment. His argument confronted the foundation of democratic rule. Citizens were not always wise, yet they held the power of judgment. In that moment, democracy itself stood against philosophy, and philosophy refused to bow. As he spoke, the jurors reacted with mixed emotions. Some leaned forward, captivated by his courage and steady voice. Others frowned, interpreting his words as defiant arrogance. The accusers glared with impatience, fearing that Socrates' eloquence might win over the hearts of jurors. Meanwhile, the younger men in the audience watched with admiration, feeling they were witnessing the birth of a legend. Socrates reminded the jury that he had refused to join political corruption throughout his life. He refused to participate in unlawful executions commanded by the 30 tyrants. He refused to arrest Leon of Salamis even when threatened by the oligarchic government. These examples painted a picture of integrity. Socrates followed justice, not orders. Such testimony held emotional force because Athens valued civic courage. Still, Socrates refused to flatter the jury. He stated clearly that he would continue practicing philosophy even if they acquitted him and ordered him to stop. This unconditional loyalty to truth stunned some citizens. The implication was clear. Socrates was loyal not to Athens' opinions, but to the universal moral law. Toward the end of his defense, Socrates made a final request, not for mercy, but for understanding. He argued that Athens needed philosophy to flourish. Without questioning, the city would stagnate intellectually and morally. He compared himself to a gadfly, a small but necessary irritant that kept the great horse of Athens awake and moving. Removing the gadfly, he warned, would lead to complacency. Some jurors may have sensed the poetic beauty of his metaphor. Others may have found it insulting that Socrates viewed himself as the only force preventing Athens from moral sleep. The courtroom atmosphere thickened with tension. The jurors were preparing to vote, and both sides knew the verdict would shape history. Socrates sat down, calm as ever. His defense had been honest and provocative. He had not begged. He had not apologized. He had defended the right to think. Now the fate of that right lay in the hands of ordinary men, many of whom had once felt humiliated or angered by Socrates' relentless questioning. As silence washed through the courtroom and ballots were distributed, every spectator felt the depth of the moment. Would Athens prove that democracy could tolerate bold truth? Or would it show that even the most philosophical city feared intellectual independence? The answer would arrive shortly and change the legacy of Western thought forever. As Socrates finished speaking and sat down in the Heliaea, the courtroom fell into a strange stillness. Rumors raced through the crowd. Some believed his fearless honesty would inspire admiration among the jurors. Others whispered that his refusal to flatter or beg had sealed his fate. The jurors now faced a monumental choice: acquit the philosopher and affirm Athens' long history of intellectual freedom, or convict him to protect the wounded identity of the city. The jury system of Athens was unique. There were no judges to instruct jurors on legal interpretation. There were no lawyers to shape arguments. The responsibility of justice fell directly into the hands of ordinary citizens. 501 men now prepared to vote. Ballots were distributed, pebbles marked for guilt or innocence. The men approached the ballot urns one by one, unseen by others, casting their judgment into two separate containers, ensuring anonymity. Many spectators leaned forward, eager to guess the outcome. They studied facial expressions and whispered predictions, but the truth of the vote would not be revealed until the official count. While the ballots were collected, the accusers watched anxiously. They knew the trial had been unpredictable. Socrates' logic had exposed contradictions in their testimonies, and his lack of fear had impressed many. However, they also knew something deeper. Anger and resentment had been growing for years. His habit of questioning respected figures had produced silent enemies. For every young admirer Socrates possessed, there were several older citizens who remembered being cornered by his questioning, laughed at by their peers when unable to answer him. Those memories were powerful and humiliating, and juries often voted from emotion rather than reason. The vote counting began inside the court building. The answer would arrive shortly and change the legacy of Western thought forever. As Socrates finished speaking and sat down in the Heliaea, the courtroom fell into a strange stillness. Rumors raced through the crowd. Some believed his fearless honesty would inspire admiration among the jurors. Others whispered that his refusal to flatter or beg had sealed his fate. The jurors now faced a monumental choice: acquit the philosopher and affirm Athens' long history of intellectual freedom, or convict him to protect the wounded identity of the city. The jury system of Athens was unique. There were no judges to instruct jurors on legal interpretation. There were no lawyers to shape arguments. The responsibility of justice fell directly into the hands of ordinary citizens. 501 men now prepared to vote. Ballots were distributed, pebbles marked for guilt or innocence. The men approached the ballot urns one by one, unseen by others, casting their judgment into two separate containers, ensuring anonymity. Many spectators leaned forward, eager to guess the outcome. They studied facial expressions and whispered predictions, but the truth of the vote would not be revealed until the official count. While the ballots were collected, the accusers watched anxiously. They knew the trial had been unpredictable. Socrates' logic had exposed contradictions in their testimonies, and his lack of fear had impressed many. However, they also knew something deeper. Anger and resentment had been growing for years. His habit of questioning respected figures had produced silent enemies. For every young admirer Socrates possessed, there were several older citizens who remembered being cornered by his questioning, laughed at by their peers when unable to answer him. Those memories were powerful and humiliating, and juries often voted from emotion rather than reason. The vote counting began inside the court building. Each juror's ballot represented not just legal opinion, but fragments of Athens' wounded identity: pride, insecurity, revenge, moral hope, religious faith, civic fear, and exhaustion from political trauma. News of the vote slowly emerged through murmurs. Socrates leaned back calmly, showing no concern. Plato later wrote that Socrates did not even change expression, as though verdicts about life and death were merely intellectual details. When the official result was announced, the courtroom erupted into noise. Socrates was found guilty. The majority was slim, only about 30 more ballots for guilt than for acquittal. If 70 jurors had changed their minds, history might have unfolded differently. The slim margin revealed how divided Athens truly was. Nearly half the court believed Socrates innocent. Yet the half that condemned him represented fear, anger, and a longing to remove the intellectual mirror that reflected their contradictions. Some jurors expressed shock. A few young men began to cry openly. Aristotle, who was only a boy at the time, would later remember stories of people saying that truth had lost to emotion that day. Supporters looked devastated, while traditionalists stood straighter, relieved that Athens had defended its gods and protected its youth from what they saw as dangerous philosophical winds. The courtroom hummed with intense energy. Some cheered, others looked away in shame. Socrates, however, did not react with despair. He accepted the verdict with tranquil dignity, saying that he had expected no different outcome. His lack of visible disappointment unsettled some jurors. They had expected fear or grief, perhaps even anger. Instead, Socrates smiled gently, as though their decision confirmed his teachings, that external events cannot harm a good man because goodness belongs to the soul, not to circumstance. But the trial was not finished. In Athens, after conviction, two proposals had to be presented, one by the accuser demanding a penalty and one by the convicted suggesting an alternative. The jury would vote again to determine punishment. Miletus demanded death by drinking hemlock. Now Socrates had to propose his own penalty: fine, exile, imprisonment, silence, or death. His next decision would shock Athens even more deeply than his defense speech. After the jury delivered its verdict of guilt, Socrates stood before them for the second phase of judgment, sentencing. In Athenian judicial tradition, each side offered proposals and the jury chose between them. This system reflected Athens' faith in the moral reasoning of its citizens. Yet it also permitted dramatic turns of emotion and unexpected outcomes. The accusers, empowered by their victory, wasted no time. Miletus proposed that Socrates receive the death penalty, arguing that a man who undermined faith in the gods and corrupted the city's youth deserved execution rather than exile or fines. Anytus strongly supported the motion and reminded jurors that Athens had recently reclaimed democracy. Tolerating Socrates might invite future rebellion. Lyco added sharp rhetoric, claiming philosophers like Socrates weakened poetry, music, and culture by replacing myth with logic. Their arguments were not just legal. They were cultural cries to preserve identity. Now the courtroom turned to Socrates, waiting for his counterproposal. Most defendants, facing death, offered something modest: a small fine, a period of exile, or a promise to change their behavior. But Socrates believed that offering a penalty in exchange for survival would be to admit guilt. He did not believe he had harmed anyone. So how could he propose punishment for a crime that did not exist? He began by addressing the jury with a surprising suggestion. Instead of death, the city should reward him. He proposed that he be maintained in the Prytaneum, the public hall where Olympic champions were honored and fed by the state. The crowd gasped. Some burst into laughter. Others clenched their fists in anger. Even those who admired Socrates were stunned. The philosopher argued that he had spent his life serving Athens by improving souls through questioning. Therefore, he deserved public honor, not punishment. In this moment, Socrates chose truth over security, philosophy over compromise. His supporters, including Plato and Crito, understood the danger in his strategy. They urged him quietly to reconsider, to propose a fine or accept exile. Socrates listened but remained firm. However, out of respect for his friends, who wished to protect him, he modified his proposal slightly. He offered to pay a fine of 1 mina, a tiny amount. The jurors saw this as sarcasm. The courtroom mood darkened further. At this point, his friends stepped forward, offering a new proposal backed by their own finances. They offered to pay 30 minas, a large sum. This was a respectful gesture, and some jurors took it seriously. But the damage had been done. Socrates had mocked the penalty process. What the jury saw as arrogance, he saw as principled consistency. He had always believed that he must obey his conscience, not manipulate others for safety. Many jurors, angered by this attitude, felt even more determined to punish him. They viewed his proposal to be honored as public mockery of Athens' authority. The second vote began, and this time the margin was not narrow. The majority of jurors condemned Socrates to death. Later reports say that nearly 80 additional jurors voted for execution who had originally voted for acquittal. These men explained their shift by stating that Socrates had insulted them by treating the penalty phase like a philosophical game. Others admitted they feared letting him live would make the democracy appear weak. The verdict was final. Socrates would die by drinking hemlock. The decision echoed through Athens as if a storm had struck the city. Some supporters broke into tears. Others stared in stunned silence. Yet Socrates remained composed. He told his followers that no harm could come to a good man in life or death, because the gods would guide his soul. His calmness gave him power that even the democracy could not steal. Hours after the sentencing, as people left the court, the debate continued throughout Athens. Some said justice had been done. The city had defended religion, democracy, and tradition. Others said Athens had executed its greatest mind out of fear and jealousy. The polarization revealed how deeply philosophy challenged the soul of the city. Socrates, however, had already accepted his fate. His words, spoken after sentencing, would become immortal. To fear death is to think oneself wise when one is not, for fearing death assumes knowledge of what we cannot know. When word spread across Athens that Socrates had been condemned to death, the city transformed into a landscape of conflicted emotions. Families gathered at dinner tables discussing the verdict. Tavern halls buzzed with arguments. Philosophers debated into the night, while priests thanked the gods for preserving tradition. The Agora, normally a place of trade and laughter, now echoed with uncertainty. Did Athens protect itself from harmful thought, or had it betrayed its identity as a beacon of free inquiry? Friends and students of Socrates felt crushed. Plato later wrote that the verdict seemed unreal, as if the city had stabbed itself. Crito, one of Socrates' closest companions, wept openly and asked how a city founded on reason could silence the greatest teacher of reason. Xenophon, who was away on military duty, heard the news later and would write about it with enduring frustration. The symbolic dimension of Socrates became especially evident during moments of cultural crisis. When societies faced oppression, their thinkers remembered Socrates. When tyrants tried to reshape truth through propaganda, resistance movements invoked his bravery. During wars, when soldiers questioned the meaning of duty, the Socratic model reminded them that moral decisions must remain grounded in conscience rather than blind obedience. In the 20th century alone, dissidents, reformers, and political philosophers repeatedly referenced Socrates as proof that free thought was older than any government, and that the intellectual soul could not be conquered by violence. From Russian revolutionaries imprisoned in Siberia to South African activists struggling against apartheid, the Socratic image found new meaning in every conflict. The strength of Socrates as a symbol did not rely on swords or armies, but on an invisible force, the power of self-examination. He taught that untested beliefs lacked value, and that truth required constant intellectual engagement. Across cultures, self-examination became not merely a mental exercise, but a moral ritual. Teachers in Europe, Asia, and North Africa encouraged students to acknowledge their own ignorance, not to belittle themselves, but to open pathways to authentic discovery. The notion that wisdom begins by admitting one does not know enough became a universal psychological foundation for education. Furthermore, Socrates' martyrdom influenced political ethics by offering a new standard for leadership. Before his time, leaders were often praised for conquering new lands or collecting wealth. After Socrates, leadership began to be measured by moral accountability, intellectual humility, and commitment to truth. Philosophers in ancient India, China, and the Islamic world examined Greek texts and identified Socratic similarities with their own ethical traditions of humility, duty, and virtue. Even rulers who never heard of Socrates unconsciously mirrored his values, because cultural globalization transplanted Socratic ideas into broader moral soil. Through these centuries, Socrates became more than a Greek philosopher. He became a global moral language, a grammar through which societies expressed their deepest hopes for justice and rationality. After the fall of the Roman Empire, a profound transformation unfolded across Europe and the Middle East. Religion became the primary interpreter of truth. Yet instead of erasing Socratic philosophy, religious cultures absorbed it. This integration reshaped theology itself. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism each encountered Greek intellectual heritage through preserved manuscripts and translations, especially those of Plato and Aristotle. Within these texts lay the voice of Socrates, questioning, examining, and resisting temptation to accept easy answers. Rather than rejecting him as a pagan, many scholars of faith recognize Socrates as an early servant of higher wisdom. Among early Christians, Socrates was interpreted as a moral prototype of sainthood. Church leaders such as Justin Martyr argued that Socrates possessed the seed of divine truth long before Christian revelation. They believed that the logos, or universal wisdom, shone through Socrates' reasoning. In Christian sermons, the philosopher who died for truth resembled saints who died under Roman persecution. His calm acceptance of execution mirrored their quiet faith. Thus, the Christian imagination placed Socrates in a symbolic lineage stretching from prophets of the Old Testament to apostles of the New. Yet Socrates did not simply influence Christianity. He helped shape the very language of Western theology. Augustine admitted that Plato's works, steeped in Socratic reasoning, opened his mind to spiritual philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, working in the medieval period, used Aristotelian logic to explain Catholic doctrine, blending faith with reason. Without Aristotle, Aquinas' synthesis could not exist. Without Plato, Aristotle would lack academic foundation. And without Socrates, Plato's intellectual transformation might never have emerged. Therefore, Socrates sits quietly behind the architecture of Christian theology, a hidden cornerstone supporting the cathedral of Western spirituality. Islamic civilization also embraced Socratic thought with intellectual enthusiasm. During the Abbasid Caliphate, translators in Baghdad's House of Wisdom rendered Greek philosophical works into Arabic. Muslim scholars such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes engaged directly with Platonic and Aristotelian ideas. Many Islamic philosophers viewed Socrates as a model of ethical purity and analytical reasoning. They appreciated his belief that truth must be pursued independently of social pressure. For them, Socrates was not a foreign figure, but a universal teacher whose logic aligned with Quranic encouragement to seek knowledge. Jewish intellectuals also drew from Socrates. Maimonides, the influential medieval rabbi and philosopher, believed rational inquiry strengthened religious faith rather than weakened it. He argued that understanding divine law required intellectual rigor, not blind obedience, echoing Socrates' practice of examining all assumptions. Thus, Socratic reasoning traveled through religious corridors, quietly shaping how communities blended faith with critical thought. Another dimension of religious interpretation came through Buddhism. Although there is no historical connection between Socrates and the Buddha, later comparative scholars noticed compelling parallels. Both men taught inner awakening, rejected materialism, and believed ignorance was humanity's greatest enemy. Socrates' final words referencing Asclepius, the idea that death was a cure, mirror Buddhist concepts of liberation from suffering. Over time, academics and spiritual thinkers began placing Socrates within a global framework of wisdom traditions. Religion did not merely adopt Socratic ideas, it reshaped and amplified them. The Socratic conviction that truth does not belong to one group or nation supported religious tolerance. His critique of mythological literalism encouraged theologians to interpret scripture metaphorically. His emphasis on humility created space for doubt, a vital ingredient in moral faith. Thus, even when Europe sank into centuries of religious conflict and dogma, Socrates' voice continued whispering inside universities, monasteries, synagogues, and mosques. For every preacher proclaiming absolute certainty, there was another scholar quietly asking Socratic questions, reminding the world that even faith should not fear reason. The story of Socrates also entered political ethics on a deep structural level. Nations and governments began using his trial as a warning about the dangers of suppressing speech, criminalizing thought, and allowing fear to dominate justice. No philosopher before him had provided such a dramatic case study illustrating how collective fear can distort law and destroy virtue. Throughout the Enlightenment, revolutions in America and France studied his trial as part of their foundations. The American founding fathers read Plato closely. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison admired Socrates as a model of civic virtue. They believed that a free republic required citizens willing to challenge authority. Jefferson explicitly warned against Athens' mistake. A democracy that silences dissent ceases to be a democracy. This principle influenced the creation of constitutional protections, such as the First Amendment. The Socratic spirit shaped free press rights, university autonomy, and judicial independence. Even the United States Supreme Court has cited Socrates' legacy to defend controversial speech. Meanwhile, in France, Voltaire and Rousseau invoked Socrates in their criticism of monarchy and church dominance. Voltaire wrote that the state which silences thinkers commits self-destruction. Rousseau, though critical of certain philosophical traditions, acknowledged Socrates as a necessary critic of state power. When France experienced political upheaval, revolutionaries pointed to Socrates as proof that justice must be anchored in reason, not tradition. Socrates also influenced modern human rights movements. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela referenced Socratic courage during his trial in Rivonia. In India, Mahatma Gandhi admired the way Socrates opposed injustice without violence. Gandhi practiced civil disobedience not through rage, but through moral discipline reminiscent of the Athenian philosopher. In the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned Socrates directly, saying that like Socrates, activists must generate constructive social tension to reveal injustice. King described himself as a student of Socrates' method, comparing philosophical liberation to racial liberation. This profound cross-cultural relevance highlights something essential. Socrates transcended geography and identity. He connected ancient democracy to modern civil rights, linking classical Athens to global conversations about justice. His willingness to die rather than betray rational conscience made him a universal model for political resistance. Moreover, modern democracies continue using historical memory of Socrates to question themselves. Universities teach law students to analyze cases Socratically. Judges study arguments about free expression through Plato's Apology. Government leaders are warned that majorities can make terrible decisions if fear outweighs evidence. Every time a nation censors speech, jails writers, or executes dissidents, global observers invoke Socrates as evidence that the suppression of thought leads to cultural decay. In classrooms today, students still reenact the Socratic trial to understand the dangers of mob justice. They analyze how democratic processes can be corrupted by emotional rhetoric and fear. They see that Socrates' prosecutors relied on association fallacies, vague accusations, and personal resentment, all tactics still used in modern politics. When governments persecute journalists or intellectuals, critics often compare those actions to the condemnation of Socrates. Thus, his legacy has become a permanent checkpoint in global conscience. His name functions like a moral alarm. Whenever societies drift toward tyranny, Socrates appears in memory, reminding them of Athens' greatest mistake. Socrates' contribution to political ethics lies not in legal documents or governmental office, but in the soul of democracy itself. He left behind a warning more powerful than any law, that truth cannot be decided by majority vote, and that virtue must outlast public fear. As centuries unfolded and human civilization evolved, the influence of Socrates extended beyond the realms of philosophy, politics, and religion. It found new expression in the development of science, literature, education, and artistic imagination. These fields, though diverse in methods and goals, share a common reliance on curiosity, self-reflection, and questioning, the very principles that define the Socratic legacy. His presence within them was not superficial. It shaped their inner logic, language, and methods. Scientists, writers, teachers, painters, and performers across cultures built their intellectual foundations on the Socratic demand that belief must be supported by reason. Plato would later describe that Socrates appeared brighter than usual, as though death had energized him rather than drained him. His expression held a strange mix of peace, alertness, and philosophical enthusiasm. He greeted each visitor by name: Simmias, Cebes, Phaedo, Crito, and Apollodorus. They were joined by several others, including guards who had grown attached to the philosopher. No one spoke at first. The silence inside the cell was longer than usual, broken only by distant echoes of footsteps passing through nearby hallways. Then Socrates laughed softly and asked why everyone looked so sad. His students stared back, stunned that a condemned man could speak so lightly. Socrates told them that grief came from confusion. He explained that they mourned his body because they mistakenly believed the body was himself. The soul, not the flesh, defined identity. He said the soul had lived before birth and would continue after death, and that true death was not the separation of life from body, but the impurity of ideas. He argued that the philosopher spends life preparing for death, because philosophy is an act of separating the soul from earthly distractions: lust, fear, desire, political ambition, and greed. On this final morning, he said death was not punishment, but liberation. These ideas comforted some listeners. Others felt torn between admiration and unbearable sorrow. To shift their minds from grief toward reflection, Socrates began exploring concepts again. The conversation that unfolded would later be memorialized in Plato's Phaedo, and its influence stretched for centuries into theology, metaphysics, and ethics worldwide. First, Socrates spoke of the forms, the eternal truths existing beyond material existence. He argued that the body deceives us through senses. We misjudge shapes, distances, sounds, and tastes. In the world of science, the Socratic approach influenced methodology long before the scientific revolution formally began. Ancient Greek natural philosophers studied the cosmos through rational inquiry rather than mythological storytelling. But Socrates added a new dimension. He challenged thinkers to justify not only what they claimed, but why they believed it. This shift from descriptive thinking to analytical thinking laid groundwork for the scientific method. Galileo Galilei, often remembered as the father of modern science, famously wrote that the universe was written in mathematical language, and only through disciplined reason could truth be discovered. Galileo's conflict with religious authorities mirrored the struggle Socrates faced with the Athenian court. Both men placed truth above safety. Newton, centuries later, embraced similar reasoning. His laws of motion did not emerge from blind acceptance, nor devotion to tradition, but from questioning why objects behaved as they did. When Newton challenged Aristotle's physics, he acted with a Socratic spirit, demolishing ancient assumptions through calculation and observation. Socratic questioning manifested clearly in Newton's dialogue between mathematics and nature. Advancements in biology, astronomy, chemistry, and psychology carry a similar rhythm of thought. Charles Darwin, studying evolution, challenged deep-rooted beliefs about creation. His willingness to question tradition at great personal risk reflects the courage of Socrates. Darwin's critics attacked him emotionally rather than scientifically, as Athenians had attacked Socrates. But time vindicated both men. The scientific community today openly acknowledges its Socratic inheritance. Peer review, experimental replication, falsification testing, and research ethics all require transparent reasoning. When a scientist claims a discovery, others demand precise methodology, logic, and evidence. But the soul alone communicates with truth. After death, freed from distraction, the soul meets forms in their purest state. Socrates said he felt grateful to be nearing that state of clarity. He did not describe heaven or hell the way later religions would. Instead, he described continuity, memory, and union with wisdom. He said the universe was rational and moral, and that a virtuous soul was naturally drawn toward harmony. Several students questioned him intensely. Sebes feared the soul might perish like steam evaporating from warm water. Simmias wondered if the soul was not a permanent being, but a harmony produced by physical material. Socrates welcomed these doubts, even at his final hour, treating them like joyful intellectual food. His strength in argument had not weakened. He pointed out that the soul governed the body, not the other way around. If the body were destroyed, that did not mean the soul disappeared. Instead, it might simply return to a state of clarity. For more than 2 hours, Socrates spoke without losing energy, humor, or conviction. The guards who stood outside listened with awe. Many of them had executed criminals before, murderers, thieves, traitors, but never had they seen a prisoner speak of death with such reason and optimism. Some whispered to one another that Athens was making a terrible mistake. Yet duty remained duty. Later that morning, a messenger from the city magistrate would bring the fatal cup of poison. Everyone in the room knew this, and yet the conversation continued with remarkable steadiness. Socrates then shifted the topic to ethics. He reminded his companions that philosophy was not just about cosmic speculation, but about how to live. Virtue, he said, was not a matter of obeying rules blindly. True virtue required knowledge. Acting justly was impossible without understanding justice itself. And understanding came from self-examination. He repeated a familiar lesson. The unexamined life is not worth living. Now, on the day of his death, this idea sounded deeper than ever. Socrates argued that ignorance produced evil, not hatred. Even those who condemned him did so from misunderstanding, not wicked intent. This statement dissolved bitterness in the cell. No one cursed Athens. No one cursed the jurors. Socrates encouraged forgiveness, because forgiveness allowed reason to remain pure. This morning's scene reads like literature, but it occurred in reality. It remains one of the most powerful episodes recorded in philosophical history. The teacher who turned death into dialogue, fear into question, and mourning into revelation. The prison doors opened to allow further visitors, and among them came people who had never before spoken with Socrates, but felt drawn to witness his final teachings. Philosophers from smaller schools, political figures hidden beneath cloaks, and even curious skeptics arrived. The guards did not turn them away. Socrates had transformed the prison into an open forum. The atmosphere shifted again, now resembling a symposium, though free of wine, filled instead with truth. One of the most emotionally charged discussions centered on the nature of the body. Socrates explained that the body obstructed the soul's pursuit of truth because it demanded constant maintenance. Hunger, sickness, pain, lust, and fatigue tied human beings to instinct and impulse. To illustrate the idea, he held up his own hands and smiled, saying his physical form belonged more to the city of Athens than to himself. If the state wished to end his bodily existence, so be it. But the state could not reach the soul. The state could not command truth or dissolve what was eternal. Death, then, became separation, not loss. The group remained silent, absorbing the words, while Socrates spoke calmly. The emotional weight inside the room intensified. Many of the younger followers began trembling, realizing that in hours they would lose their teacher forever. Their tears filled the cell with sadness so great that even Socrates paused. He warned them that despair was a sign of misunderstanding. Death was not a defeat, and sorrow was not a tribute to love. True love honored the truth the beloved lived for. He reminded them that if his ideas were correct, they would meet again in another reality. At one point, Apollodorus cried out in anger against the Athenians who sentenced Socrates. He shouted that the city deserved destruction, and that the gods would punish those responsible. Socrates raised his hand gently, stopping him. He rebuked rage as foolish. He explained that hatred was a poison worse than hemlock because it burned the mind. Socrates insisted that Athens acted in ignorance, not cruelty. His forgiveness stunned even the guards. The executioners who later carried the cup would later tell stories of this moment to their own children, describing it as the instant they realized philosophy could be larger than politics. The conversation then turned toward ritual preparations. Crito asked whether Socrates had instructions for burial. Socrates laughed and told them not to worry about burying Socrates, because Socrates was not his body. After death, his friends could bury the remains any way they liked. The true Socrates, the soul, would already be gone. Xenophon later repeated this teaching, claiming it changed Greek attitudes toward funerals. Soon afterward, Crito pulled Socrates aside and again begged him to flee. The ship from Delos had returned, but the city was still distracted and escape might be possible. Socrates shook his head with compassion. He explained that running away would make his teachings meaningless. If he broke the law to save himself, every argument about justice he had ever offered would collapse. For Socrates, it was better to die a philosopher than live as a hypocrite. The cell door opened again. This time the guard who entered was not a philosopher nor a friend, but the state's chosen execution officer. He held a wooden cup and explained that the poison would be ready soon. His voice cracked as he spoke. He told Socrates he admired him deeply and apologized for what he had to do. Tears rolled down his face. Socrates comforted him and told him to return when the drink was prepared. The guard bowed and hurried away, unable to look back. Silence filled the room once more. In that silence, the enormity of history seemed to settle over the men. Socrates' students realized they were not just witnessing death. They were witnessing the birth of philosophical martyrdom. Many understood that their teacher would become a symbol far beyond Athens. If Socrates had sought to illustrate virtue, courage, wisdom, and honesty, then he would achieve it not only in life, but now in death. Somewhere outside, the bells of temples sounded across the city as morning passed into noon. When the guard returned, the final act of Socrates' earthly life would begin. Around midday, the sound of sandals echoed down the corridor. The execution guard returned, carrying the cup of hemlock. The poison was made from a local plant, mixed into liquid and stirred until its green tint darkened. Execution by hemlock was considered merciful by Greek standards, painless, calm, and efficient. Muscles would relax, body temperature would drop gradually, then sensation would dissolve beginning at the toes and rising through the limbs to the heart. Socrates understood exactly what awaited him, and yet he displayed no tremor of fear. When the guard entered, every man inside the cell fell silent. Many looked away, unable to face what was coming. The guard spoke softly and said, "Socrates, you must drink this without delay." His hand shook. Socrates, however, thanked him for his honesty and asked what the proper procedure was. The guard explained with a choked voice that Socrates must walk around after drinking to help the poison circulate. Then, once numbness reached his abdomen, he should lie down. The guard added, "May fortune be kinder to me than today." He turned away, wiping tears from his face. Socrates held the cup and examined it briefly, like an artifact of philosophical meaning. He raised it to his lips and spoke one final message to his students about the relationship between body and soul. He told them to remember that the body was merely a tool, and that reason was the true path to freedom. Then, without hesitation, he drank the poison. Plato later wrote that no man in history ever faced death so peacefully. There was no trembling, no panic, no hesitation. Socrates drank as though taking medicine that would cure him from the illness of physical existence. The result inside the cell was devastating. Apollodorus burst in a loud sobbing. Simmias and Cebes covered their faces with their garments. Even men who had boasted strength could not hold back tears. Some beat their chests. Others shook uncontrollably. The sound of grief filled the small room so violently that the stone walls themselves seemed to vibrate. Yet through this chaos, Socrates remained gentle. He ordered silence so he could finish his last thoughts clearly. His authority, even now, controlled the room. He walked slowly around the cell, following the instructions. As numbness reached his feet, he pinched his toes and smiled, saying he felt nothing there anymore. This demonstration, scientific, calm, curious, startled those watching. Socrates was studying his own death as though it were a philosophical experiment. He described the sensation analytically, observing the poison climb through his body. Eventually, his legs collapsed beneath him. His friends lowered him gently onto the bed. As the cold traveled upward, Socrates delivered his last recorded words. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Pay the debt and do not forget." These words shocked the room. Asclepius was the god of healing. The meaning was profound. Socrates suggested that death was a cure, not a wound, liberation from bodily suffering and ignorance. His final statement was not about Athens, not about injustice, not about regret, but about completion of spiritual medicine. Moments later, the poison reached his heart. His breathing slowed. His eyes softened. Plato later wrote that he had never seen anyone die so beautifully. Socrates' chest rose one last time, and then the philosopher slipped silently into death. The room exploded into grief. Students cried openly. The guard wept at the door. Even the executioner sat on the floor with his head in his hands. They had not simply lost a man, they had lost a worldview. News of his death spread through Athens within hours. Some citizens celebrated, believing the city safer. Others felt shock, guilt, or confusion. A few whispered that Athens had committed an unforgivable mistake. Many who had once feared Socrates now mourned him, realizing too late that they had destroyed a treasure of the mind. History shifted in that hour. Philosophy had gained a martyr, truth had gained a guardian, and Athens had gained a scar that would never fully heal. When Socrates died, the air within the prison cell seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves were trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just occurred. The guards stepped backward, unable to meet the eyes of the grieving students. Outside, day was turning into evening, and the sounds of Athens, vendors calling out prices, horses pulling carts along cobblestone roads, and citizens arguing about politics, continued without pause. Yet among those who had been present at the execution, time itself appeared broken. They could not imagine how the world could move forward after losing the man who had reshaped the meaning of truth. The body of Socrates lay still, wrapped in dignity rather than tragedy. Plato said that even in death, his teacher's face did not display terror or regret, only peaceful release. The students slowly gathered around the bed. Some touched Socrates' hand, hoping to hold one last memory in their palms. Others simply stared, stunned that the man who seemed intellectually invincible had a body that obeyed mortal laws. They knew philosophy taught him that death was not a disaster, yet witnessing it with their own eyes made grief unavoidable. Crito gently closed his friend's eyes and covered the body. Athenian officials permitted the followers to take the remains for burial, partly because they did not want to risk turning Socrates into a martyr through mistreatment. The students carried the philosopher's body out of the prison into the night air. Torches flickered along the narrow streets, casting trembling circles of light on stone walls as the group traveled south toward the outskirts of the city. They wanted to bury Socrates far from public chaos, where his memory could rest quietly. Yet the truth was that his legacy would never rest. It had already begun expanding beyond their control. As they moved, people watched silently. Some nodded in quiet respect. Some spat on the ground. Others whispered apologies. These reactions mirrored the divided response Athens would experience over the coming days. Inside households, the verdict was questioned. Some citizens realized that Socrates had become more powerful in death than in life. Others believed the execution proved the strength of democracy. Still others felt a growing unease, an instinctive fear that the city had killed not a criminal, but a conscience. Within 72 hours of the execution, regret began spreading like wildfire. Men who had voted for guilt now confessed they felt manipulated by emotion. Rumors circulated that some jurors could not sleep. It was whispered that one juror, overcome by guilt, refused food for days. Pain grew deeper when people learned of Socrates' final words, a symbolic religious message rather than political rage. Instead of condemning Athens, he spoke of healing and liberation. The political elite felt the shift as well. Anytus, one of the main accusers, stopped appearing in public events. He sensed the changing public opinion. Citizens muttered that he had driven a noble man to death. Lyco avoided public spaces, fearing retaliation from poets who admired Socrates. Miletus, the instigator, vanished almost entirely. Historical sources suggest he may have left Athens to escape shame. Whether these rumors hold complete truth is debated, but the emotional reality is clear. Many Athenians began viewing the execution as an injustice, even before Socrates had been buried. Soon after the burial, discussions erupted throughout the city. Philosophers gathered in gymnasiums and agora corners, speaking in hushed tones. Political reformers questioned whether democracy could survive if it punished dissent. Religious leaders debated whether divine wrath would fall upon Athens for killing a man who spoke of spiritual duty. In taverns and workshops, ordinary men argued voluntarily for hours, fueled by wine and moral confusion. Some insisted that no city can thrive if teachers are executed. Others countered that order must be protected from dangerous energy. Athens was no longer united, if it ever truly had been. Instead, the execution split the city along lines of age, class, and ideology. Older men, raised in traditional customs, tended to support the sentence, believing religious stability and civic obedience were more important than philosophical rebellion. Younger men, brought up in the new climate of intellectual inquiry, were furious. They accused the court of silencing truth and feared they would become targets next. But perhaps the most striking reaction came from young children and teenagers who had never even spoken to Socrates. They saw his death as a story of bravery, not failure, and retold it in schoolyards and homes. They spoke about the old man who questioned leaders and stood firm in his beliefs even when facing poison. For them, Socrates became a heroic symbol of questioning authority. His legend was already being born. Athens had executed the man, but the idea remained alive. And the more people talked, the stronger that idea grew. In the weeks following Socrates' death, Athens shifted into a state of emotional instability and intellectual reorganization. For years, the city had worn the identity of democratic brilliance, an example of freedom, knowledge, and artistic enlightenment. But after the execution, Athens began confronting the contradiction of being both a birthplace of philosophy and a destroyer of its finest representative. People questioned their government, their court system, and the meaning of intellectual liberty. These questions echoed through the city with unsettling intensity. Socrates' followers reacted differently. Some disappeared into private grief, unable to face the city without their teacher. Others turned grief into silent fury. Plato, young and deeply attached to Socrates, retreated from public life, feeling disgust and betrayal. He later wrote that the execution convinced him democracy was flawed, a system too easily swayed by opinion instead of truth. This belief would shape his future writings, particularly The Republic, a text criticizing democratic weakness. Without Socrates' death, Plato's philosophical direction may have been totally different. Crito and Apollodorus stayed in Athens temporarily to preserve their teacher's memory. They wrote down conversations, preserved details, and spoke with people who had witnessed the trial. Their emotional wounds were so deep that friends claimed they aged rapidly in just weeks. Other students, fearing prosecution, fled the city entirely. Aristippus traveled to Cyrene and founded schools of ethical thought. Euclides left for Megara and created a new philosophical movement blending Socratic and Eleatic ideas. Nearly every student carried a fragment of Socrates with them, turning Athens into a launch point for philosophical diaspora. Meanwhile, the government felt pressure from multiple angles. Some officials believed the execution had been necessary to prove governmental authority, especially after the terror of the 30 tyrants. They feared weakness more than they feared injustice. They argued that letting Socrates live could have encouraged future rebellions. But these justifications felt hollow against the emotional tidal wave rising in the streets. Soon, tragedy struck the accusers. Anytus lost political power and was eventually exiled from Athens. Later Greek sources report that his own son fell into alcoholism and disgrace. A bitter irony, since Anytus acclaimed Socrates corrupted young men. Lyco disappeared from history almost entirely, and Miletus, ridiculed for his role, became a symbol of misguided prosecution. Whether these outcomes were purely historical or partly mythologized, one thing remains true. Athens did not celebrate its victory long. This environment echoes the Socratic courtroom. Truth must withstand interrogation. Even the language of science mirrors Socratic structures. It uses hypotheses, ideas requiring proof, counterexamples to test validity, and dialectical debate to refine theory. Meanwhile, Socrates influenced literature with equal power. Writers across eras used his life and voice as narrative inspiration. Shakespeare, for instance, infused characters with Socratic skepticism. Hamlet's endless questioning of existence, morality, and truth resembles the Socratic mind grappling with internal contradiction. Tolstoy admired the philosophical commitment of Socrates and modeled several characters in his novels to explore moral conscience. Dostoevsky, facing political imprisonment and philosophical crisis, often described the human soul in Socratic terms, oscillating between ignorance and awakening. In poetry, Socrates appears as a symbol of the thinker who stands against society. Romantic poets invoked him to represent rebellion against conformity. Modernist poets saw him as an intellectual martyr. Contemporary writers use him to question social hypocrisy and to explore themes of individuality. Drama and theater also owe a debt to Socrates. Before philosophy existed as structured text, it existed as dialogue, a form shared with theater. Greek playwrights studied Socrates' method of questioning. Later dramatists converted the trial into stage performances. Some portray him as hero. Others present him as tragic figure destroyed by political misunderstanding. Film adaptations continue this tradition. In many cultures, stories write him not as a historical figure, but as the eternal teacher who challenges every generation. In all these areas, the Socratic presence remains unmistakable, a guiding reminder that literature should not flatter opinion but expose truth. Education, perhaps more than any other field, reflects Socratic genius directly. Public regret intensified when foreign cities criticized Athens. In Sparta, politicians mocked Athenians for killing their wisest man. In Thebes, scholars used the execution as evidence that Athenian democracy was morally unstable. Athens, once admired as intellectual capital of Greece, suddenly stood on defensive ground. The shame stung deeply. The trial meant to strengthen democracy had instead created international embarrassment. Inside Athens, a silent intellectual resistance began to form. Some scholars debated anonymously through scrolls and secret gatherings. The city government grew anxious. While they had executed Socrates to silence dissent, the city looked more divided than ever. Nearly every educated household debated the trial nightly. Parents who once taught children to admire democracy now hesitated, worrying that their children might grow up fearing honest thought. Artists also responded. Within a year, Dramatic poets began reinterpreting Socrates in symbolic plays. Although direct praise risked legal consequences, playwrights crafted characters resembling Socrates, wise, misunderstood figures who died at the hands of frightened rulers. Audiences recognized these characters instantly. Their applause carried hidden meaning, protest disguised as entertainment. Over time, Athens realized that Socrates had not died quietly. He had become a haunting cultural presence. His manners, words, ideas, and voice replayed endlessly in the minds of those who had heard him. Even people who never visited the Agora in their lives now quoted his sayings. Children repeated them. Workers joked about them. Traders used them to settle disputes. Socrates' vocabulary had woven itself into the cityscape. Ironically, the philosophers who remained alive in Athens now spoke with more confidence than before. They believed Socrates had opened a doorway by sacrificing himself. His death made Athens understand what philosophy truly meant: fearless examination, even against death. Thus, the execution that intended to silence philosophy instead amplified it. Athens created a martyr, and the presence of a martyr changes everything. As months turned into years, the execution of Socrates evolved from a local political dispute into a universal lesson about truth, courage, and intellectual freedom. His story began spreading far beyond Athens through oral tradition and written testimony. Travelers carried the tale along trade routes. Sailors repeated it in Ionian harbors. Scholars shared it in conferences of thought. Soon, Socrates' death was known across the Greek world, not merely as a historical event, but as a moral symbol. One of the most important forces behind this transformation was Plato. Deeply wounded and inspired, he devoted his life to ensuring that Socrates lived eternally through written dialogue. Instead of writing biography or mourning poetry, Plato transformed conversations into philosophical masterpieces. In Apology, he reconstructed Socrates' courtroom defense with stunning detail. In Phaedo, he narrated the final execution scene. In Republic, he imagined a new world guided by reason rather than majority opinion. Through these works, Socrates was reborn not as a corpse, but as a character who continued to speak across centuries. Plato framed his teacher as an intellectual hero, uncorrupted by fear or vanity. These dialogues shaped future civilization on a scale nobody in Athens could have predicted. While the Athenian court assumed the trial would remain a regional legal matter, Plato's writings transformed the event into the foundation of Western philosophy. Later thinkers such as Aristotle, Zeno, Epicurus, Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, Descartes, and Kant engaged with Socratic ideas directly or indirectly. Some agreed, some disagreed, but all were influenced. The execution became a turning point in human scholarship, teaching that ideas must survive even when their carriers die. Schools around the Mediterranean began organizing around Socratic ideas. In Megara, Euclid's school promoted logic and paradox. In Cyrene, Aristippus emphasized pleasure and subjective judgment, reshaping moral philosophy. In Elis and Corinth, Euclid's students continued investigating ethics through Socratic method. Within a century, Socrates became the origin point for diverse philosophical traditions, all claiming his lineage. And yet, Socrates' legacy did not remain confined to philosophy. It entered law, politics, religion, and literature. Roman statesmen used his example to argue that governments must protect free speech. Christian thinkers later compared Socrates to saints who sacrificed themselves for truth. Enlightenment writers in Europe invoked his name when resisting censorship and monarchy. In modern courts, lawyers still reference his trial when defending intellectual liberty. The execution that Athens intended as erasure became eternal inscription. Meanwhile, Athens itself changed dramatically. Generations after Socrates' death, the city publicly regretted its actions. Statues were erected in his honor. Philosophers openly praised him. Plays performed in the theater of Dionysus portrayed Socrates as a saint of wisdom. Most astonishingly, in later years, the Athenians punished one of Socrates' accusers posthumously, executing or exiling him for his role in the case. Whether this was Miletus or Anytus depends on the source, but the symbolism remains clear. Athens eventually condemned the condemnation. The city reversed its judgment morally, if not legally. Even in everyday life, Socrates became a role model. Young men imitated his questioning style. Teachers encouraged students to examine beliefs. Women admired his moral strength and influenced household discussions. In this way, philosophy, which once belonged mostly to elite male circles, expanded into general culture. Political leaders learned something too. Executing unpopular thinkers did not guarantee social peace. Instead, it risked creating intellectual legends more powerful than armies. Socrates proved that reason could outlive governments, courts, and judges. Perhaps the most poetic transformation occurred on a human level. People who had feared philosophy now approached it with curiosity. The same Athenians who once hissed at debates started asking questions at symposia. Philosophical conversation became fashionable. Socrates had awakened something deep within the Greek world, the desire for wisdom rather than blind obedience. By the end of the 4th century BCE, the Socratic legacy had become immortal. The philosopher who died by hemlock gained more voice than he ever possessed in life. Athens learned that truth cannot be executed. Socrates had predicted this himself. He said the city could kill him, but not silence philosophy. He said people would continue questioning, continue seeking virtue, continue challenging arrogance. And he was right. His death became a beginning, not an ending. This is the great irony left for history to ponder. Athens intended Socrates' execution to preserve its identity. Instead, it reshaped world identity. The city defended tradition through death, but gave birth to a new tradition through memory. Socrates stepped into eternity, and the world followed. The death of Socrates marked a monumental turning point in the history of human thought, not only because it signaled the end of one man's life, but because it triggered a revolution in philosophy, education, and cultural identity across Greece and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of his execution, Athens struggled to redefine itself. The city, still haunted by the Peloponnesian War and its political instability, now bore a new psychological burden. It had killed its most outspoken thinker. During the months following the execution, the Agora felt different. Philosophers walked more cautiously, not because they feared new trials, but because they recognized that the philosophical climate had changed forever. Socrates' intellectual spirit lingered in every conversation, shaping everything that followed. The first major transformation came through Plato, Socrates' most devoted student. Plato was barely 30 when Socrates died, yet the execution ignited something powerful inside him. Instead of collapsing into despair, Plato began a monumental mission. He would rebuild philosophy from the ground up. He traveled across Greece, absorbing ideas from Pythagorean mathematicians, Eleatic philosophers, and Egyptian scholars. But everywhere he went, he carried Socrates' memory like a guiding star. He realized that Socrates' method, investigating truth through dialogue and reason, could not remain a simple oral tradition. It needed structure, documentation, and preservation. Plato's first major step was writing the Apology, capturing Socrates' trial speech as authentically as memory allowed. Through this text, Socrates' voice re-entered the world. Readers felt they were sitting in the courtroom, watching the philosopher expose contradictions in Miletus' arguments. The Apology became more than a historical account. It became an argument for free reasoning as a defense against social injustice. It was Plato's declaration that Socrates might have died physically, but intellectually he would live eternally. Next came an even more daring move. Plato founded the Academy around 387 BC. This institution, nestled in sacred groves dedicated to Athena, became the world's first continuous center of higher learning. students from across the Mediterranean traveled to study there. They sat beneath olive trees and engaged in discussions using Socratic questioning, now guided through Plato's expanded system. At the academy, mathematics was not merely counted or measured, but used to understand forms and patterns shaping existence. Logic became a discipline, not just a skill. Ethics transformed into a subject worthy of deep analysis. Politics became an investigation into the structure of the ideal city rather than simply a study of governance. Plato took Socrates' moral teachings and expanded them into grand metaphysical architecture. The idea of eternal forms, unchanging truths existing beyond material perception, emerged from Socratic seeds. Socratic definitions of justice evolved into Plato's exploration of the just city in his Republic. The philosopher king, a ruler who governed through reason rather than popularity, reflected Socrates' struggle against democratic corruption. The academy took young men and trained them not in courtroom persuasion, but in truth. Plato did not create a religion, yet he built a structure that functioned spiritually. It had rituals of reasoning, tests of belief, and moral demands. One entered the academy not to win arguments, but to discover inner order. Under Plato, Athens regained philosophical power, not through politics, but through education. Foreign scholars arrived stunned that the city that executed Socrates now produced the deepest intellectual system the world had ever seen. However, Athens itself continued to live with guilt. Some jurors who supported the execution grew ashamed as Plato's dialogues grew famous. They realized history would judge Athens, not Socrates. Discussions in symposia changed dramatically. Instead of mocking philosophers, people began quoting them to show intelligence. A silent revolution in values swept through the city. Socrates, who had never written a word, had become the foundation of a new intellectual era. Even as the academy flourished, Athens remained deeply aware that every achievement traced back to one man who had stood before a court and refused to betray his conscience. The tragedy of Socrates became the motivation behind Plato's mission, and through that mission, a new world began to take shape. While Plato harnessed Socrates' memory to build new intellectual worlds, another towering figure emerged from the next generation, Aristotle. He arrived in Athens at the age of 17, traveling from Stagira with curiosity and humility. When he entered the academy, he encountered a philosophical universe unlike anything found elsewhere, a universe Socrates had made possible indirectly. Aristotle's presence would change history yet again. Aristotle studied under Plato for 2 decades. During that time, he learned not merely the doctrine of forms or ethical systems, but the method itself, the relentless Socratic pursuit of truth, the willingness to ask questions, and the ability to accept ignorance as a starting point rather than a flaw. Aristotle developed his own system gradually, questioning elements of Plato's metaphysics, but never abandoning the Socratic foundation, reason. Unlike Plato, who embraced abstraction, Aristotle pursued empirical observation. He dissected animals, analyzed constitutions, studied astronomy, and cataloged plants. In each observation, one can detect Socrates' influence. Careful questioning, relentless curiosity, and respect for logical structure. Aristotle eventually created independent schools of thought: ethics, biology, aesthetics, physics, and political theory. The Western scientific method owes its foundation to Aristotle, and through him, indirectly, to Socrates. Thus, the execution did not silence intellectual progress, it unleashed it. Modern logic, mathematics, and legal reasoning trace roots back to the conversations that happened in a simple prison cell before the Hemlock Cup arrived. Meanwhile, the academy continued to function as a cultural powerhouse. Foreign diplomats visiting Athens described the school with awe. They spoke of students debating abstract truths with mathematical proofs drawn in the dirt. They described Plato walking the courtyards in flowing robes, followed by students taking notes on wax tablets. Beneath the surface, however, another transformation brewed. Athens began reshaping its political identity in light of Socrates' death. The democratic system that condemned him slowly evolved to allow more tolerance toward intellectual diversity. The government eventually passed informal protections for philosophers. Courts became hesitant to charge thinkers with impiety. Dramatic playwrights shifted tone. Where Aristophanes once mocked Socrates in comedy, later writers elevated philosophical figures as respectable characters. Cultural attitudes had changed. Even religion, once weaponized against Socrates, softened. Priests began inviting philosophers to speak in temples, suggesting divine truth and rational truth could coexist. This shift reflected a broader pattern in history. Societies often persecute their visionaries first, then later adopt their visions to rebuild themselves. Athens was no exception. After Socrates' death, people began studying philosophy more seriously because philosophy had suddenly become costly. Socrates had shown that truth demands sacrifice. Young thinkers now believed that studying philosophy made one part of a noble lineage. Aristotle eventually left Athens after Plato's death and founded the Lyceum, another intellectual center. There, he taught students to walk with him as he lectured. His walking school, or peripatetic method, symbolized movement, philosophy becoming mobile, adaptable living. He trained Alexander the Great, whose military empire later spread Greek culture across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Through Alexander, Socratic thought traveled thousands of miles from India to Egypt, Persia to Italy. Consider the irony. Athens executed Socrates to protect itself, but the chain reaction that followed spread Athenian philosophy across the globe, far beyond what one small city-state could dream. When Alexander conquered Persia, Socratic reasoning traveled along trade networks. When Aristotle's students criticized superstition, they carried the echoes of Socrates' courtroom defense. Athens eventually realized that although democracy had condemned Socrates, democracy itself survived partly because Socrates existed. His questions strengthened the intellectual muscles of the city, forcing future leaders to consider ethics, law, and citizenship. No trial, law, or execution erased him. He had become the invisible foundation beneath every Greek classroom, every debate chamber, and every academy. Through Plato and Aristotle, Socrates shaped the understanding of justice, truth, and civic responsibility for centuries. His execution did not silence philosophy. It transformed it. Philosophy no longer belonged to the elite few. It became a universal discipline capable of shaping empires, religions, and scientific revolutions. With Plato and Aristotle shaping intellectual development, Athens confronted its own historical reflection. The trial of Socrates forced Athenians to examine their identity. Were they a people who celebrated free thought, or a society frightened by it? In the decades following Socrates' execution, this question resurfaced repeatedly. Athens suffered further political turmoil, not as bloody as before, but psychologically destabilizing. Macedonian conquest under Philip II and later Alexander diminished Athenian independence. Citizens felt powerless and nostalgic for a time when Athens led the world in ideas and empire. In response, philosophers became guardians of civic spirit. They preserved Athenian pride through schools of thought rather than military victories. The emergence of new philosophical movements, Stoicism, Cynicism, Epicureanism, revealed Socrates' indirect influence. Cynics like Diogenes imitated Socrates' simplicity, rejecting wealth and proclaiming independence of thought. Stoics like Zeno mirrored Socrates' belief that self-control and inner virtue defined moral greatness. Epicureans adopted critical thinking to pursue mental peace rather than public power. Even skeptics, who questioned whether certainty was possible, followed Socrates' path of challenging assumptions. Socrates had become the philosophical root beneath every Greek school. Some schools embraced his teachings, others rebelled against them, yet all referenced him as their point of origin. Athens also began honoring Socrates through memorials. Statues were erected near the Agora, depicting the philosopher deep in thought. Public lectures praised him as an ethical model. Children learned Socratic sayings much like modern students memorize poetry. His name entered legal rhetoric as shorthand for moral resistance. Historians observe that collective guilt transformed Socrates into a cultural saint. The same democracy that once condemned him now portrayed him as its highest representative. Poems described him as Athens' conscience, while orators cited him to support reforms. Athens, through remembrance, regained a moral compass. Over time, tourists traveled from foreign lands just to see where Socrates walked, talked, lived, and died. Pilgrims sat beneath olive trees where he once held discussions. Philosophers lectured at the academy steps about the meaning of virtue. Residents pointed proudly to the prison building, no longer ashamed, but emotionally conflicted. It was a place of tragedy and triumph, sadness and intellectual rebirth. Modern teaching methods depend heavily on dialogue. Instead of transferring information from teacher to student mechanically, educators pose questions that provoke thinking. This style, known formally as the Socratic method, remains in use at elite universities worldwide. In it, a teacher challenges students not to memorize, but to justify. Students must evaluate assumptions, explore contradictions, and refine ideas. Law schools in the United States famously use the Socratic method to train attorneys. Professors ask rapid-fire questions requiring students to justify every argument. The technique teaches future lawyers to think critically and speak accurately under pressure, just as Socrates demanded clarity from his respondents. Medical schools likewise employ ethical questioning techniques rooted in Socratic debate to help doctors reason through moral dilemmas. Thus, through science, literature, and education, Socrates continues shaping the intellectual destiny of the world. Artistic culture, too, reflects the Socratic legacy in profound and enduring ways. Ancient Greek sculpture emphasized human dignity and rational order, qualities celebrated in Socrates' thinking. One famous image carved centuries after his death, showing him seated in contemplation, connects physical reality with intellectual memory. His thick beard, broad nose, and deep brow became iconic features recognizable throughout Western art. Yet these portrayals do more than illustrate his body. They embody the spiritual and intellectual force that shaped civilization. Artists paint Socrates not as warrior or king, but as humble giant, a man whose power came from questions. Renaissance artists revived Socratic imagery enthusiastically. Raphael included Socrates in his iconic fresco, The School of Athens, placing him among the greatest minds in history. There, Socrates stands calmly with a hand raised, teaching the younger men around him, capturing the eternal essence of dialogue. The greatest irony unfolded centuries later when Rome absorbed Greek culture. Roman educators introduced Socratic dialogue into legal and political training. Latin writers praised Socrates as a hero of ethical courage. Early Christians later compared Socrates' death to martyrdom. They admired that he suffered injustice without compromising truth. Thus, Socrates crossed cultural boundaries and entered universal imagination. Meanwhile, the philosophical culture of Athens developed maturity. Instead of mocking those who questioned norms, Athenians learned to ask deeper questions themselves. Public debates became more structured. Schools multiplied. The city transitioned from military superpower to intellectual capital. Its new weapon was the spoken and written word. Even today, when modern democracies debate free speech, judicial integrity, or educational philosophy, they echo Socrates' legacy. His questions remain alive. What is justice? What is virtue? What is truth? What makes a good citizen? Should government suppress ideas? Can democracy survive disagreement? These questions, born in ancient Athens, remain philosophical engines in universities, courts, and parliaments around the world. Thus, The long arc of history reveals something extraordinary. Socrates' execution sparked intellectual evolution on a global scale. He died because his city feared the power of ideas. Yet that power proved unstoppable, crossing time, language, and geography. Socrates' story reminds humanity that ideas are more durable than armies, more influential than kings, and more transformative than laws written in stone. His method of questioning changed how humans understand themselves. His courage reshaped how societies judge truth. And his willingness to die rather than betray reason made him immortal, not as a myth, but as a standard of human dignity. As generations passed after Socrates' execution, Greece entered a new cultural phase known today as the Hellenistic era, shaped profoundly by political shifts, educational networks, and philosophical diversification. The Socratic spirit, rooted in dialogue, reason, and the pursuit of moral clarity, continued to flourish even as the political map changed dramatically. The classical polis structure weakened, monarchies replaced democratic assemblies, and empires began absorbing city-states. Yet through these transitions, the ideas seeded by Socrates, nurtured by Plato, and systematized by Aristotle survived like intellectual roots spreading beneath shifting soil. After Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured into multiple kingdoms. The Antigonid leadership in Macedon, the Ptolemies in Egypt, and the Seleucids in Asia. These empires carried Greek language and culture everywhere they conquered. Merchants, soldiers, priests, and scholars left their homelands and resettled throughout Asia Minor, Persia, India, and the Near East. Wherever they went, they brought Greek ideas, and among those ideas was a story about an Athenian philosopher who drank poison rather than abandon truth. The spread of Greek culture created universities, libraries, and academies in new locations. The most famous example was the Library of Alexandria, a project born from Greek and Egyptian cooperation. Within those walls, scrolls preserved the works of Plato and Aristotle, and scholars copied Socratic dialogues repeatedly. His method of questioning influenced fields outside philosophy: mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine. Euclid applied Socratic reasoning to geometry, proving that truth could be demonstrated logically rather than accepted through authority. Archimedes used rational questioning to explore physics. Even Eratosthenes, who measured the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, operated under the assumption that the universe obeyed rational principles available to human investigation. This transition from myth to mathematics, from poetry to proof, was a continuation of the Socratic revolution. Ancient thinkers believed the cosmos could be understood through numbers and reason, not divine whims. Before Socrates, some philosophers had hinted at this approach, but Socrates gave intellectual courage to the movement. His execution reinforced that ideas mattered more than physical existence, inspiring scholars to go further. New schools of philosophy appeared, each grounded in Socratic examination. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, taught that virtue lay in mastering emotion, rejecting fear, and living according to rational order. Ideas that echoed Socrates' calm acceptance of death. Stoics admired Socrates profoundly. They saw him as the ideal sage, unshaken by misfortune, honoring reason above passion. Stoic literature quoted Socrates endlessly, and students memorized his sayings to strengthen their minds. Meanwhile, Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, embraced a different branch of Socratic influence. Epicurus argued that philosophy should liberate humans from fear, especially fear of death. In this sense, he mirrored Socrates' final hours. Epicurus claimed that death was nothing to us because where we exist, death is not, and where death exists, we are gone. Although their views differed on metaphysics, Epicureans admired Socrates' courage and used his example as a psychological anchor. Even the Cynics, especially Diogenes of Sinope, held Socrates as their spiritual model. They rejected wealth, mocked social conventions, and lived publicly with extreme independence. Diogenes famously told Alexander the Great to stand out of my sunlight, a statement echoing the Socratic refusal to bow to earthly power. Every Cynic performance, sleeping in public, questioning customs, was a theatrical extension of Socratic humor and defiance. Thus, across the Hellenistic world, Socrates' influence was not a single stream, but a river branching into many channels. Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, Skepticism, Platonism, and Aristotelianism. These schools debated constantly, sometimes fiercely disagreeing, but none denied their origin. Every student, whether praising or rejecting, acknowledged Socrates as the grandfather of their intellectual lineage. As Greek kingdoms expanded geographically, Socrates became a cultural export. His story traveled along trade routes into Jewish communities, Persian territories, and Asian courts. In Egypt, Greek priests mixed Socratic reasoning with Egyptian theology. In Babylon, Greek scholars translated Socratic texts. Over time, even distant cultures began to view Socrates as a universal symbol, a man who died for truth and reason. The irony of this spread is profound. If Athens had not executed Socrates, perhaps his name would have remained confined within local circles. Instead, martyrdom stretched his influence across continents. Civilization after civilization absorbed pieces of his method. Thus, during the Hellenistic period, Socrates transformed from a local teacher into a philosophical ancestor of entire civilizations. He became an intellectual compass guiding future scholars who never saw Athens, never spoke Greek, and never heard his voice, yet believed deeply in his values. As Greek power began blending into the Roman world, another major transformation occurred. Socrates entered Roman consciousness. At first, Rome was not a philosophical culture. Early Romans valued military strength, civic duty, religious tradition, and legal discipline. They admired Greek art, but distrusted Greek intellectualism, believing it too abstract for practical Roman life. However, by the 2nd century BCE, Greek captives and immigrant scholars began teaching the Roman elite. Through these channels, Socrates entered Rome as not merely a Greek figure, but as a guide for ethical living. Roman senators, lawyers, poets, and generals read Plato and Xenophon. Many were astonished that a man had chosen death rather than compromise moral integrity. In a culture obsessed with fame and honor, Socrates demonstrated a higher honor, the dignity of truth. Roman thinkers soon began referencing Socrates as an example of moral excellence. One of the first Roman philosophers who openly admired Socrates was Cicero, a statesman and lawyer whose speeches shaped Roman political culture. Cicero repeatedly invoked Socrates, calling him the wisest of all Greeks. In his writings, he described Socrates as the man who brought philosophy down from the heavens and placed it into human homes and cities. Cicero saw Socrates as the bridge between cosmic speculation and practical ethics. Another Roman admirer was Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. Although Seneca lived centuries after Socrates, he wrote essays encouraging his students to imitate Socratic composure. Seneca taught that rage, fear, and desire weakened rational judgment. He urged men to die with calm acceptance, just as Socrates had. Many of Seneca's letters sound like reinterpretations of the prison dialogues from Plato's Phaedo. Later still, Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher, built his teachings almost entirely on Socratic ideals. Epictetus told students that the world could enslave their bodies, but never their reason. This echoed Socrates' belief that the soul and moral will remain untouched by physical force. Epictetus even claimed that if Socrates could endure prison and death, then all men could endure hardship with dignity. Roman rulers also learned from Socrates, though not always willingly. Julius Caesar read Greek texts and admired Athenian democracy. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and Stoic philosopher, filled his private journal with reflections resembling Socratic humility. He wrote that anger should be dissolved by reason, fear by perspective, and hatred by understanding, sentiments deeply Socratic in nature. Marcus Aurelius viewed death as transformation, not defeat. Though separated by 500 years, he and Socrates shared the same calm vision. But Rome did not only adopt Greek philosophy for individual development, it integrated Socratic thought into law, politics, and education. The Roman legal system began shifting away from superstition and toward rational argument. Lawyers trained themselves to challenge assumptions logically, much as Socrates exposed contradictions in Miletus accusations. Debates in the Senate mirrored Socratic questioning. Senators demanded definitions, rejected hearsay, and probed ethical motives. Schools in Rome adopted the Socratic method. Teachers asked students to defend their reasoning step by step. Pupils learned not to memorize answers, but to build ideas through evidence. For the first time, education became interactive rather than hierarchical. Students could question their teachers openly without punishment, something unimaginable in many earlier societies. Socrates also influenced Roman religious thought. Pagan priests respected his concept of the divine, not mythic gods causing storms, but moral intelligence guiding the world. Many Romans became open to the idea that the universe functioned through rational order, not arbitrary divine anger. This shift made the later rise of Christianity easier, because Christianity inherited Greek philosophical language through Rome. Buddhism argues that ignorance causes suffering. Socrates insisted ignorance causes wrongdoing. Their convergence shows shared human insight. Hindu thinkers connected Socrates with karma philosophy. If wrongdoing arises from ignorance, then self-examination provides liberation. Socratic virtue mirrors dharma, duty aligned with truth. The Bhagavad Gita teaches Arjuna to act wisely through self-examination. Socrates could have spoken similar guidance. Modern spirituality also uses Socrates. New Age movements emphasize mindfulness, meditation, emotional honesty, and rejection of vanity, all Socratic values. Self-help authors quote him constantly. Psychological therapies encourage confronting inner demon voices, similar to Socratic daimonion. Socrates also appears in atheism. Ironically, atheists claim him as symbol of rational doubt. They admire his rejection of superstition. They argue his death shows danger of dogma. Thus, Socrates belongs both to religion and to secularism. No other thinker bridges these extremes so gracefully. His trial fundamentally shaped global religious identity. When authorities kill thinkers for questioning tradition, societies recall Socrates and feel shame. His death warns religions not to silence inquiry. Religious tolerance movements across Europe invoked him to argue that conscience must remain free. Indeed, Socrates prevented religion from decaying into blind obedience. He forced faith to justify itself intellectually. Without that challenge, religion might never have developed advanced theology. Socrates did not destroy religion, he refined it. The most powerful element of Socrates' religious legacy lies in his exploration of immortality and the human condition. Socrates spoke calmly about death on the final day of his life. His friends sobbed. He comforted them. They feared oblivion. He embraced possibility of eternal consciousness. In Phaedo, he presents arguments for immortality that still influence philosophers today.